The contract sat on the table between us like a loaded gun. Daniel's finger jabbed toward it, then toward me. "Sign it, Dad. Just sign it. This house isn't yours to hold on to anymore." I looked at my son's hand, the same hand I had once wrapped around a hammer and taught to drive a nail straight into oak without splitting the grain. That hand was shaking now, not from cold, not from nerves, from something uglier. From the particular desperation of a man who has run out of other people's money to spend. Melissa stood beside him, arms crossed over her chest, her mouth set in the thin, satisfied line of a woman who believed she had already won. She snatched the pen from the coffee table and pressed it into my palm, the way you'd press a weapon into the hand of someone you needed to see finish the job. "It's just a formality," she said. Her voice had the bright, brittle cheerfulness of a person reciting a script she'd rehearsed in the mirror. "You'll still live here. Nothing changes. We just need your name off the deed, so we can refinance." Nothing changes. I had built this house's bones with my own hands 40 years ago. I knew what a load-bearing wall sounded like when someone started chipping away at it, pretending it was decoration. Behind them, in the doorway, my granddaughter Sophie stood frozen with a plate of dinner rolls still in her hands, watching the three of us the way a person watches weather they can't yet name, not quite a storm, but close enough to feel the pressure drop. "Dad." Daniel's voice cracked, softened, the way it always did right before he asked me for something. "Please, we're drowning here. You don't understand what it's like." I understood more than he knew. I had understood it for 5 years. Ever since the afternoon, I signed away my own workshop, 40 years of tools, 40 years of sawdust in my lungs, 40 years of a life built one plank at a time, to keep his name off a bankruptcy filing. I never told him what that cost me. I never told anyone. I looked down at the pen in my hand. Then I looked past it, past the contract, past my son's trembling fingers, to the wooden cabinet against the far wall, the one Elena used to keep her sewing things in. The one that had gone missing from the hallway 3 weeks ago and reappeared here, in their living room, refinished and repurposed like it had never belonged to anyone at all. I set the pen down on the table, not the contract. "Before I sign anything," I said quietly, "I think there's something you should both see first." I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. Daniel's face changed before I even unlocked the screen. Some part of him already knew. He just didn't know how much. If you found this story today, I'm glad you did. Leave a comment below and tell me your city or country. Let's build something together here. A brief note before we go further. This story blends fiction with purpose, crafted for entertainment, and the lessons worth carrying home. Names and details are coincidental. What you take away from it, however, is entirely yours to keep. I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. There is a version of that evening my son tells people. I've heard pieces of it secondhand, through cousins, through neighbors, through the particular silence that falls over a room when someone realizes I've just walked in. In his version, I'm the problem. In his version, I've always been the problem. None of it is true. My name is Thomas Reyes. I'm 65 years old. For 40 years I worked as a carpenter outside Portland, Oregon, building cabinets, framing porches, restoring furniture that other people had given up on. I was never a rich man, but I knew how to build things meant to last. That kind of patience doesn't come from money. It comes from understanding that wood doesn't lie to you. It shows you exactly what it's made of if you're willing to look closely enough. I raised Daniel to understand that. I thought he did. I was wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, not at that living room table with the contract between us, not with Melissa's pen pressed into my palm. Let me start 5 years earlier. On an afternoon, I sold the one thing I never thought I'd have to sell. 5 years ago, On a gray October afternoon, I sold my workshop. Not the tools, not the house. The workshop itself, a converted barn on 2 acres outside town that I had built board by board starting the year Daniel was born, expanding it every time I had enough saved to add another wall. It smelled like cedar and machine oil and 40 years of my life. I had planned to die in that building, sanding some piece of furniture nobody had asked for, just because my hands needed something to do. Daniel called me on a Tuesday night. I remember because it was raining, the kind of steady Oregon rain that doesn't announce itself, just settles in and stays. His voice on the phone was different than I'd ever heard it, flat, scraped hollow, the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not say anything until I'm done." He'd invested in a development deal 2 of his coworkers had talked him into. Real estate, fast money, the kind of promise that sounds reasonable right up until it doesn't. He'd put in everything, savings, a second mortgage on his condo, a loan against his 401k. The deal collapsed in 11 weeks. What was left wasn't a loss. It was a hole, 340,000 deep, with his name signed at the bottom of every page. "I'm going to have to file," he said. "Bankruptcy. I don't know what else to do." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time before I answered. Outside, the rain kept coming down steady against the workshop windows, the same windows I'd installed myself the summer Elena was pregnant with him. "Don't file anything yet," I said. "Give me 2 weeks." I never told him what those 2 weeks cost me. I called a commercial buyer I'd worked with for years, a man who'd wanted the property since before Daniel could walk. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning in November, standing in the empty barn one last time, running my hand along a workbench I'd built my own father's tools. I paid off every cent of Daniel's debt within the month. Quiet. No lawyers, no headlines, no bankruptcy on his record to follow him for the next 7 years. I told him it was an investment, a father helping his son through a hard patch, nothing more. I never once mentioned the number. I never once mentioned what I'd given up to make it disappear. Elena had passed 18 months before that call. I think some part of me needed Daniel to still need me, needed there to be something left in this world only I could fix. I didn't know yet that 5 years later, I would be sitting in his living room with a pen in my hand, being told my own name didn't belong on a piece of paper anymore. I didn't know the debt only ran in one direction. I moved into Daniel's house 8 months ago, after the loneliness in my own place got too heavy to carry alone. Melissa said it made sense, save on 2 mortgages, keep an eye on my blood pressure, let Sophie grow up close to her grandfather. I told myself that was the whole reason. The first thing that disappeared was Elena's watch. It was a small gold thing, nothing extravagant, the kind of piece a working man buys his wife on their 20th anniversary, because he's finally saved enough to make it feel like it matters. She'd worn it every day for the last 15 years of her life. After she passed, I kept it in the top drawer of the dresser in my room, wrapped in the same handkerchief she'd always kept it in. One morning in March, it wasn't there. I asked Melissa if she'd seen it. She barely looked up from her phone. "Maybe you moved it somewhere and forgot, Thomas. Happens. It happens." She said it lightly, like she was doing me a favor by not making it a bigger deal than it was. I searched the whole room twice. I searched it a third time that night after everyone had gone to bed, on my hands and knees, checking under the dresser with a flashlight, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with my age. 6 weeks later, it was Elena's jewelry box, the whole thing, not just a piece. I noticed the empty space on the shelf in my closet before I noticed anything else was wrong. When I mentioned it at dinner, Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Melissa sighed, the particular sigh of a woman running out of patience for an old man's confusion. "Dad, You've been more forgetful lately, she said. Maybe we should think about getting you checked out, just to be safe. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound exactly like what she was already suggesting I was: confused, unreliable, a man losing his grip on his own belongings. It was Ray who said it out loud first. Ray Delgado had lived 2 houses down from me for 11 years before I moved, a retired county sheriff's deputy with the kind of quiet attentiveness that never fully retires. He came by one Saturday with a six-pack and sat with me on the back porch, and after a while he said, without any preamble at all, "Thomas, I saw Melissa's car outside Grantham's Pawn on 5th Street Tuesday afternoon. Twice this month, actually." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Grantham's was 20 minutes from the house. There was no reason for Melissa to be there, unless she meant to be. "You sure it was her car?" I asked. "Blue Camry, dented rear bumper, I'm sure." I thought about the watch. I thought about the jewelry box. I thought about the particular way Melissa had started locking the door to the room she called her office, the one that used to be a guest room, the one I'd never once been invited into. "Keep your eyes open for me, Ray," I said. "Don't say anything to anybody. Just watch." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he already suspects the shape of what's coming and doesn't want to say it out loud before it's confirmed. I went back inside that night and stood in the hallway outside my room for a long time, looking at the empty space on the closet shelf where Elena's jewelry box used to sit. I didn't cry. I'd learned, somewhere in the last 5 years, that grief doesn't always announce itself with tears. Sometimes it just sits quiet in your chest, taking notes, waiting for the moment it'll finally be useful. I didn't know yet that the cabinet, the one with the ring hidden inside it, would be next. Before I tell you what happened next, the moment I understood exactly how far this had gone, let me pause here for a second. If you're still with me, drop a comment and let me know. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you'd think to know there are real people on the other end of these stories. A quick reminder: this story blends fictional elements into its storytelling, crafted for reflection as much as entertainment. If it's not for you, no hard feelings. Feel free to step away here. But if you're staying, what comes next is the part I still think about most. The cabinet went missing on a Sunday. I know because I'd gone into the workshop space off the garage. The little corner Daniel had let me set up with my old tools. Nothing like the barn I used to have, but enough to keep my hands from forgetting what they knew. And the space where the cabinet had stood for 6 months was just empty floor, a faint outline in the dust where its feet had rested. Elena's cabinet, the one I'd built the year after we married, out of a single walnut tree that had come down in a storm behind her parents' house. I'd spent 4 months on it, dovetail joints, hand-rubbed finish, the kind of work you don't rush, because you know you're only going to get one chance to build something that's going to sit in a house for the next 50 years. Inside it, in a compartment along the base that only I knew how to open, was the second ring. I'd had it made the year before Elena got sick, a small platinum band to replace the one that had worn thin after 4 decades on her finger, something I planned to give her on our 40th anniversary. She never made it to that anniversary. The ring had been sitting in that hidden compartment for 3 years, and I hadn't told a living soul it existed. Not Daniel, not Sophie, not even Ray. I stood in that empty corner of the garage for a long time, feeling something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the particular kind of quiet that settles over a man when he finally, fully understands what he's dealing with. I didn't confront anyone that day. I want you to understand that about me. I've never been a man who raises his voice to get an answer. 40 years of woodworking teaches you that force doesn't reveal what's true. Patience does. You don't tear into a piece of furniture to see what's wrong with the joint. You look closely, quietly, and you let the wood show you where it's been mishandled. That night, I called Ray. I need a favor, I said, and I need you to not ask me why until I'm ready to tell you. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then, in the same steady voice he'd used every day of his career, he said, "What do you need, Thomas?" I told him, and 2 days later, for the first time since I'd moved into that house, I stopped being the man things were happening to. I became the man who was watching back. Ray installed the camera on a Wednesday afternoon while Daniel was at work and Melissa had taken Sophie to a dentist appointment. It took him less than 20 minutes. A small unit tucked into the bookshelf in the living room, angled toward the hallway and the door to what Melissa called her office, powered by a battery pack he swore would last 3 months without needing to be touched. "You don't have to do anything with what it records," he told me, standing back to check the angle. "But you'll have it. That's the difference between being helpless and being prepared." I thought about that sentence for a long time after he left. The second thing I did alone. Harold Kim and I had known each other since before either of us had gray in our hair. He'd handled Elena's estate when she passed, patient with me through every question I hadn't known enough to ask at the time. I called his office on a Thursday morning and asked for the first appointment he had open. I sat across from his desk 2 days later, and I told him everything. Not with anger. I want to be clear about that. I've never been a man who does things out of anger. I told him the way I'd tell a client what was wrong with a piece of furniture they'd brought me to restore. Plainly, without embellishment, laying out exactly what needed fixing and why. "I want to put the house in Sophie's name," I said. "Held in trust until she's 18. And I want a clause, if anyone in that household pressures me, deceives me, or attempts to have me declared incompetent in order to gain control of any property in my name, they forfeit any claim to it. Permanently." Harold didn't ask why. He'd been doing this long enough to recognize the particular tone of a man who has already made peace with a decision before he walks through the door. "That's airtight, Thomas," he said, making notes. "But I have to ask, does your son know any of this is happening?" "No," I said, "and he won't, not until it matters." I signed the documents on a rainy Tuesday in April, the same kind of rain that had been falling the night Daniel called me 5 years earlier to tell me about the 340,000 hole he dug for himself. There was something almost fitting about that, though I didn't let myself sit with it too long. I want you to understand something about what I was building in those weeks. I wasn't building a trap. A trap is something you set for an animal that doesn't know any better. What I was building was closer to a lock, something that simply stopped working the moment someone tried to force it open the wrong way. I went back to the house that evening the same way I always did. I made dinner with Melissa the way I always did. I asked Sophie about her homework the way I always did. Nobody in that house had any idea that somewhere between the workshop corner and Harold Kim's office, the ground beneath their feet had already shifted. They just hadn't stepped on it yet. It was Melissa's idea to call it a family dinner. She sent the text on a Monday. "Let's all sit down together Friday night, just the 4 of us. I'll make the roast." Small things like that should have warned me sooner than they did. Melissa didn't cook roast for ordinary Fridays. Melissa cooked roast when she wanted a room to feel warm enough that nobody noticed the temperature was about to drop. I found out later from Sophie that the debt had gotten worse. Much worse. An online sportsbook account under Melissa's maiden name, 6 figures deep, the kind of number that doesn't stay quiet in a marriage no matter how good you are at pretending. Daniel had covered 2 rounds of it already, draining what little savings they'd managed to rebuild since his own collapse 5 years earlier. There wasn't a 3rd round left in the account. There was, however, a house, My name on the deed, worth considerably more than what they owed. And a father who, as far as they knew, was getting older, a little more forgetful, a little easier to guide toward a decision if you framed it the right way, at the right table, in front of the right amount of pressure. Friday came. Melissa had set the table with the good plates, the ones that only came out for holidays. Daniel poured wine before dinner even started, his hand a little too quick on the glass, a little too generous with the pour. I noticed. I notice most things now. 5 years of quiet observation will do that to a man. The man who arrived at 6:45, introduced as a friend of Daniel's from the office, happens to do some real estate law on the side, had a briefcase and a manila folder and a handshake that lasted half a second too long. His name was Gary. He talked about the market, about refinancing rates, about how quickly a home equity line could close if all parties were, quote, on the same page. I ate my dinner. I asked Sophie about her science project. I let the wine sit untouched in front of me, because a man who spent 5 years learning to watch doesn't dull his own eyes on the one night it matters most. Somewhere around the second course, Gary opened the folder and slid a document toward the center of the table, angled just enough that it faced me and not Sophie. Just a formality, Thomas, he said, using my first name like we were old friends. Standard quitclaim. Gets your name off the title so Daniel and Melissa can move forward with the refinance. Takes 2 minutes. Melissa's hand found the pen before mine did. She held it out, smiling the particular smile of a woman who has already rehearsed the next 5 minutes in her head and is certain of how they end. I looked past her, past the contract, past Gary's briefcase, to the doorway where Sophie stood frozen with a plate of dinner rolls in her hands. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this was the moment everything I'd built quietly over the last several weeks was finally going to matter. I reached into my jacket pocket. I took out my phone. I didn't raise my voice, I never do. Before I sign anything, I said, I think there's something you should both see first. I set the phone on the table, screen facing up, and pressed play. The video Ray had captured 3 weeks earlier filled the small screen, grainy but unmistakable. Melissa, standing in the garage corner, wrapping Elena's cabinet in a moving blanket. Melissa, loading it into the trunk of the blue Camry with the dented bumper. Melissa, at the counter of Grantham's pawn, sliding it across to a man in a gray apron who examined it for exactly the amount of time it takes to name a price. The room went very still. That's, Melissa started, and then stopped, because there was nothing that sentence could end with that wouldn't make things worse. That's Elena's cabinet, I said quietly. The one I built the year we married. The one you told me I must have misplaced, along with her watch, along with her jewelry box. Because I was, what was the word you used? Melissa. Forgetful. Daniel's face had gone the color of old paper. Dad, I didn't know. You didn't ask, I said. There's a difference. I turned the phone toward Sophie's direction, without meaning to embarrass her, just so she'd understand, later, why everything that happened next needed to happen. Then I reached into my other pocket and took out a folded piece of paper, the pawn shop receipt. Grantham had given it to me himself 2 days earlier. Once Ray explained, calmly, and with his old deputy's badge number still fresh enough in the man's memory to matter, that the item had been sold without the true owner's consent. I bought it back, I said. All of it, the watch, the jewelry box, the cabinet. Paid in full, receipts included, dated and notarized. Gary shifted in his seat, his manila folder suddenly looking a great deal less official than it had 10 minutes earlier. Thomas, I think we should. You should tell this table what firm you actually work for, I said, since it isn't the one on your card. I called the State Bar Association Wednesday morning. There's no Gary Whitfield license to practice real estate law in Oregon. There's a Gary Whitfield who sells timeshares in Bend. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Then Sophie's voice broke the silence, small and steady from the doorway. "Mom, is that why you took my birthday money in June? For Grandpa's watch?" Melissa's face crumpled. Daniel turned to look at his wife with an expression I hadn't seen on him since he was 9 years old, and got caught in a lie, so plainly stupid there was no version of talking his way out of it. I let the silence sit. I've learned that silence, held long enough, does more work than shouting ever could. Then, quietly, I said the thing I'd been carrying for 5 years. "I sold my workshop to keep you out of bankruptcy, Daniel. I never told you the number. I never told you what it cost me. I did it because that's what a father does." I looked at the contract still sitting untouched in the center of the table. "This house isn't in my name anymore," I said. "It hasn't been for 3 weeks. It's in Sophie's name, held in trust, with a clause that revokes any claim from anyone in this room who tried to take it from me through pressure or deceit." Daniel's glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the good plates. For a moment, nobody moved. The wine spread slowly across the tablecloth, dark as a bruise, and nobody reached for a napkin. Gary was the first to leave. He didn't say goodbye. He gathered his folder with hands that weren't quite steady and let himself out the front door, and none of us watched him go, because none of us cared where he went. Melissa stood, chair scraping back hard against the floor. "You had no right," she said, her voice climbing, cracking at the edges, "sneaking around, spying on us in our own house. It stopped being your house the day you sold my wife's things to a pawn shop," I said. I kept my voice level, not cold, just finished. She looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend her the way he always had. He didn't. He was staring at the shattered glass on the table, at the wine soaking into the linen, and something in his face had gone somewhere I didn't recognize. "Dad." His voice came out smaller than I'd heard it in 30 years. "Dad, please." He came around the table before I understood what he meant to do. His knees hit the hardwood in front of my chair, hard enough that I heard the sound of it, and his hands found the sleeve of my jacket and gripped it the way a drowning man grips the only thing floating near him. I didn't know what she was doing with the pawn shop, I swear to you I didn't know. But the money, I knew about the money. I let it happen. I told myself you'd never notice. I told myself you were better off not knowing how bad it had gotten again. His breath came in short, broken pulls. "Please don't take the house, please. We have nowhere else to go. I'll get a second job, I'll pay you back every cent, just, please don't do this." I looked down at my son, 36 years old, kneeling on the floor of a house that used to belong to me, gripping my sleeve the same way he used to grip my hand crossing a parking lot when he was small enough to still need me for that. My chest ached in a place that had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with the particular grief of watching your child become someone you no longer recognize, and understanding at the same time that some small stubborn part of you still loves the stranger anyway. "I'm not taking the house," I said quietly. "I already gave it to Sophie, to keep it safe from both of you." He made a sound then, not quite a sob, not quite a word, something raw and wordless that came from somewhere low in his chest. His hands were still locked around my sleeve, shaking. I reached down, gently, and unwound his fingers one at a time. "Get up, Daniel," I said. There was no anger left in me by then. Just tired. Just done. I sold everything I had once to keep you from drowning. I'm not going to let you pull me under with you a second time. Sophie was still standing in the doorway, the plate of dinner rolls finally set down somewhere, tears running silently down her face, watching her father on his knees, and her mother frozen by the shattered wine glass, and her grandfather sitting very still, having said the truest thing anyone had said in that house in 5 years. Before I go on, I want to pause here for a moment. If this story has reached you tonight, drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in that room? I read every single one, and it means more than you'd think to hear from you. A gentle reminder: this story carries fictional elements, woven in for reflection as much as entertainment. If that's not for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're still here with me, what comes next is the part that took the longest to make peace with. I didn't stay for dessert. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell you I stood up from that table as some kind of quiet hero, that I delivered my final words and walked out into a clean and simple sunset. That isn't what happened. What happened was slower and heavier and far less satisfying than the moment itself might have suggested. I helped Sophie pick the shattered glass off the tablecloth because her hands were shaking too hard to trust with it. I told Daniel, still sitting on the floor with his back against the cabinet, that I loved him, because it was true, and because 5 years of silence had taught that love and consequence are not opposites. They can sit in the same room together, at the same table, even when one of them has to leave. I told Melissa nothing at all. There are people for whom silence is the only honest thing left to offer. I drove home that night, to my own apartment, the small one-bedroom place I'd kept even after moving in with Daniel, telling myself at the time I was only keeping it as a formality. It hadn't felt like a formality in a long while. It felt that night like the only room in the world that was entirely mine. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and I thought about Elena. I thought about the ring still sitting in the hidden compartment of a cabinet that was, as of that morning, legally and finally back in my possession. I thought about the 40 years I'd spent building things meant to last, and how I'd spent the last 5 trying, quietly, to figure out whether people could be built the same way. Some can. I believe that. I have to believe that, or none of the last 5 years make any sense at all. Some can't be built. They can only be protected from, gently, without cruelty, but completely. I didn't sleep much that night. Somewhere around 3 a.m., my phone lit up on the kitchen table. A text from Daniel. 4 words, nothing more. Dad, I'm sorry, truly. I read it twice. I didn't answer yet. I wasn't ready to yet. I didn't answer Daniel's text for 6 days. Not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. I've never once done anything out of cruelty. I waited because I needed to know, first, whether the words meant something, or whether they were simply the sound a man makes when he's run out of other options. I'd learned, over 5 quiet years, the difference between the two. It takes time to tell them apart. Ray came by on the 3rd day with coffee and no questions, and we sat on my small balcony and didn't talk about any of it, which was exactly what I needed. Harold called on the 4th day to confirm the trust was fully recorded, the house legally Sophie's, held safe until she turned 18, untouchable by anyone who'd tried to take it the wrong way. You did this the right way, Thomas, he told me. Slow. Clean. No one can undo it. I thanked him and meant it. By the 5th day, I heard from Sophie, not Daniel. She called to tell me her parents had separated. Melissa had moved into her sister's place across town, the gambling debt now impossible to hide. Once the pawn shop receipts became part of a conversation, nobody could keep quiet anymore. Daniel had stayed in the house, though it wasn't his to keep for long. Sophie's voice was steady when she told me. Steadier, I think, than it had been in months. Sometimes a house gets quieter before it gets better. On the 6th day, I drove back to the house one last time. Not for the contract, not for anything that needed signing. I came for the cabinet. Daniel let me in without a word. He looked smaller than I remembered, the particular smallness of a man who has finally stopped performing for an audience that's no longer watching. We didn't talk much. I found the cabinet where I'd left it, ran my hand along the walnut grain the way I had the day I finished building it 39 years ago, and opened the hidden compartment along the base. The ring was still there, small platinum, exactly where I'd left it 3 years before. Daniel watched me hold it. "What is that?" he asked quietly. "Something I never got to give your mother," I said. I didn't explain further. Some things don't need explaining, only carrying. Before I left, he stood in the doorway the way Sophie had that Friday night, and he said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I understand now. What it cost you. All of it." I looked at my son for a long moment. "I know you do," I said. "That's enough for tonight." It wasn't everything. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before Elena passed, before the money, before 5 years of quiet unraveling I hadn't let myself see clearly until a pawn shop receipt made it impossible not to. But it was something honest, standing in a doorway, and honest was more than I'd had in a long time. I drove home with the cabinet in the back of my truck and the ring in my pocket, and for the first time in 5 years, the road ahead of me felt something I was choosing, not something I was simply enduring. I put Elena's cabinet back in my apartment, in the corner by the window where the morning light finds it first. I placed the ring on top of it, in a small dish, where I can see it every day without having to open anything to remember what it means. Sophie visits on weekends now. I've started teaching her what I know, how to read the grain of a piece of wood before you cut it, how to know the difference between a joint that will hold and one that only looks like it will. She's good with her hands, better than I was at her age, if I'm honest. I think Elena would have loved watching that. Daniel and I talk now, carefully, the way two people rebuild a bridge they both remember burning. It isn't what it was. I don't know if it ever will be. But he calls on Sundays, and some Sundays I answer, and that's more than I let myself hope for 6 days after he knelt on that floor and asked me not to leave. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: family justice doesn't come from shouting, and it doesn't come from revenge dressed up as anger. It comes from the quiet moment when you finally stop accepting less than you built your whole life to deserve, and you protect what's yours, not with cruelty, but with patience and proof, and the kind of resolve that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. I'm not a perfect father. I stayed silent too long. I let people believe my patience was the same thing as my permission. If you see yourself anywhere in my story tonight, please don't wait 5 years the way I did. Don't wait for the dinner that breaks you open. Family justice begins the moment you choose your own dignity over someone else's comfort, and that choice, I promise you, is always yours to make. This is what a quiet revenge dad means to me. Not cruelty, not anger, just a father who finally stopped carrying what was never his to carry alone. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. A last gentle note: some upcoming stories on this channel contain fictional elements, crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that isn't for you,